The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar, Semiconductors, AI in Space, New Frontiers of Dominance. As the human race makes ever greater technological advances, three key spheres stand out as the new frontiers of global dominance: semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and space exploration. With their huge potential for innovation, these technologies are also crucial to economic and geopolitical power. How might the intersection of politics and technology play out from the perspective of rising powers or smaller states? What are the implications of the private sector's role in developing these transformative tools? And how can the world's nations embrace collaboration, ethical considerations, and sustainable practices to ensure widespread benefits? To learn more about this timely topic and engage with our panel of experts, please tune into our next live debate.
Hello and welcome. I am Humphrey Hawksley, your host for a Democracy Forum debate where we discuss global issues of the day, often reaching conclusions that you will not see in the mainstream media and commentary. For the next hour and a half, we're going to be talking about technology, high tech, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and space, new frontiers of dominance. Now, not long ago, that might have sounded like science fiction, but not anymore. And then back in the 80s, Ronald Reagan famously launched his Star Wars program, yet the famous movie and a strategic defense network based in space. And with the competition over semiconductors, how many of us really know what they do? And artificial intelligence, where are the new frontiers of dominance? To decide this, we have a superb panel: Gordon LaForge, Stephanie Cam, Susan Ariel Aaronson. The Democracy Forum Chair, Barry Gardner, we hope will be able to sum up at the end. He is a member of Parliament for Britain's ruling party and may be called away at the last moment. But as always, I have the privilege of asking the President of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce, to lay out the background and the canvas of our debate. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, which will focus on the evolving technological race for economic and military geopolitical dominance. I'm very grateful to the team at Democracy Forum for responding to the strategic challenges of this rapidly developing aspect of global power politics and for inviting such a preeminent panel of experts to discuss the leading issues. I'm delighted that they've all agreed to participate and that Humphrey Hawksley will be acting as moderator. In an uncanny allusion to a previous appropriation of space, President Trump last week announced the deployment of an impervious missile shield costing $175 billion, a golden dome straddling the United States and guaranteeing, he promised, I quote, close to 100% protection against hypersonic missiles, ballistic missiles, and advanced cruise missiles. All of them will be knocked out of the air. And over 40 years ago, when proclaiming a similar plan to protect American territory from space, the Strategic Defense Initiative, President Reagan spoke from the Oval Office to explain that, I quote, our security is based on being prepared to meet all threats. So the perception of malign threats to national security emanating from technological advantage continues to define all aspects of United States defense planning in order to maintain dominance wherever it appears to be challenged. Critics of the Golden Dome have been quick to point out, however, that it will cost far in excess of the president's estimate. It will be unable to eliminate all the threats that have been identified. It will prompt the further escalation of ballistic weapon systems deployed by hostile states, and it will degrade the common ownership of space. As Jeffrey Lewis of the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies observes, I quote, space used to be a benign environment, even throughout the entire Cold War, but having an arms race there will make it malign. The threat of losing the competitive edge in the manufacture of advanced semiconductors and the gestation of AI has led successive United States administrations to impose export controls and tariff walls especially to hinder Chinese producers. The Biden administration passed the Chips and Science Act in 2022 and subsequent legislation to build a high fence around advanced technologies. Targeted export controls have strengthened under President Trump, when last month's United States advanced semiconductor manufacturer NVIDIA was barred from exporting its H20 chips to China, resulting in a loss of sales of $5 billion and a drop of its stock price of over 7%. But it is not clear, however, if the United States will succeed in thwarting China's technological ascendancy. Research published last year by the Institute for AI Policy and Strategy in San Francisco reveals that Chinese manufacturers are able to source between 10 and 50% of advanced semiconductors required for AI model training, smuggled from America through third countries such as India and Malaysia. Indeed, the meteoric rise of Chinese AI companies such as DeepSeek has accelerated the urgency to assess the technological balance of power emerging between countries, writes the former White House advisor on science and technology, Craig Mundie. And ironically, Washington's attempt to hamper China's AI sector by imposing export controls on high-end United States chips may have contributed to the DeepSeek breakthrough, and reminds us, I quote, that China and the United States are neck and neck, and that our technological edge is not guaranteed, as the former CEO and chairman of Google, Eric Schmidt, recently warned. So thank you very much for deciding to watch our webinar today. And if you have any questions or comments, please pass them to the panel through the chair.
Lord Charles Bruce, thank you very much for that space. A malign environment? And how does the US thwart China's technological ascendancy? As Lord Bruce said, give us your views, ask us your questions, challenge our thinking. Our first panelist is Gordon LaForge, a senior policy analyst at New America. That's an independent, non-partisan think tank where he researches and writes on the very topic of our debate. Among his recent papers, Power and Governance in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. He's also connected to Stanford University and Arizona State University, and he's been a fellow at the Defense Planning at the US NATO mission in Brussels. His topic today is that very one, the private actors who are pioneering these technologies despite their increasing strategic and geopolitical relevance. Can we trust them? Gordon LaForge, tell us what you know.
Thank you, Humphrey. And Lord Bruce, thank you for organizing this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here. As came out in the comments that both of you made at the beginning, there is a Cold War-esque veneer to this whole discussion of artificial intelligence, semiconductors, the pursuit for technological supremacy that we see. And it seems, at least in the United States, there's very much a bipartisan consensus that we are in some new arms race. What's different, however, is that we are not just dealing with the United States, China, the UAE, India, Russia, but the players are private companies as well. So we're talking about OpenAI, SpaceX, Google, Microsoft. This is probably the first time in the modern era that we have geostrategically important technologies, AI probably preeminent among them, that are not in the hands or directed by the government. There's no visibility into the development of AI in the US from the government. It's being developed by private labs. Other transformational technologies like the internet, space travel, nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, GPS, these were all directed by the Defense Department and heavily involved with the government. So we're in an era where the commercial sector plays a very important role in geopolitics because these technologies are increasingly central to geopolitical power in our time. So there are two kind of dynamics at play in this story. One, tech companies have become incredibly powerful. So by measures of market capitalization, the 5 most valuable companies in the world are U.S. tech firms. These are, historically wealthy companies. They reach all around the world. They operate in over 100 countries. They have millions of users around the world. So their reach is really unprecedented. The CEOs of the large tech companies are global players on par with heads of state. The representatives of Google or Microsoft will often have more influence in a country than the U.S. ambassador will. A telling sign is that there are now more than 40 countries, or around 40 countries, that have diplomatic missions in Silicon Valley just to interface with the tech companies as if they were foreign governments themselves. The other half of this story, in addition to the rise of powerful tech companies, is that, at least in the United States, public capacity has been dwindling for decades now. So since 1980 in the United States, industry research and development funding has exceeded that of the government. The gap is wide and growing wider. Government research and development as a share of GDP in the United States is now at its lowest level since before World War II. So the public sector has taken a step back at the same time that the private sector has become very powerful in creating and deploying these technologies. And this is accelerating right now to an alarming degree in the Trump administration. We're seeing dramatic cuts to federal scientific and technology agencies and research capacity, and to universities, which are a very important part of the innovation ecosystem. The Trump administration's proposed budget for fiscal year 2026 proposes cutting NASA by 25%, the National Institutes of Health by, I believe, 37%, and the National Science Foundation by more than half. So the public capacity is going to reduce even further. So what are the consequences of this state of affairs where we have private actors who are wielding nation-state level influence in geopolitics, thanks to technology? One, this creates problems for democratic oversight in the United States. So we have already seen that there are conflicts that emerge between the interests of the two sectors. So that these are private companies that have their own private interests that don't always align with the national interest. In 2022, Starlink, Elon Musk's satellite service provided by SpaceX, was providing essential battlefield communications in Ukraine. Elon Musk, in part due to conversations he was having with other world leaders, threatened to cut off access for the Ukrainian military to Starlink service, causing the Pentagon to have to scramble to negotiate a deal in order to keep that service on. It is it's a startling state of affairs when a private individual is able to determine the course of a war. In someone like Elon Musk now has that capability. Second, in addition to this problem of interests that aren't always aligned, second is that because these technologies are in the commercial sector, diffusion and proliferation becomes a lot easier and harder to control. Any governance strategies based on containment, such as the export controls that the U.S. has tried to put in place on semiconductors, these are likely to fail, and they're not going to succeed. It is both, I should mention, a good thing when you have private companies involved in creating these technologies. It creates lots of opportunities for innovation. The kind of creativity that comes out of the private sector in the United States is very impressive. However, the downside is that it's harder to contain, and you can't keep secrets at scale when you have when you have technologies that are in the hands of the private sector. The third consequence, and the thing I worry about most, and is kind of harder to define, is that if technologies like AI are just being developed by the commercial sector, then they are going to be created in service of commercial interests, not public interests or national interests. We're going to see less of a focus on scientific discovery, on big national missions like reaching the moon, the kind of missions that characterize the post-war era, scientific discoveries that benefit all of the public and that are then dispersed for the public. These are less likely to happen if the technologies are being developed to then fulfill investor demands for returns and to create we're more likely to see consumer applications and focuses on helping corporations minimize their bottom line in AI, in using AI, for instance, rather than creating breakthroughs that benefit society overall. So I think these are some of the consequences of this, and I will stop there.
Thank you. I have got a 1,000 follow-ups for that, but I'll allow myself just a couple, just to put that historical perspective in that you drew upon. And correct me if I'm wrong on this. 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, it was sort of science, technology, wake-up call for the US. They created a government agency called the Defense Advanced Research Protection Agency, DARPA, and that then was meant to keep America ahead of everything. Is what is happening now then that those very scientists and brains that went into DARPA then are now going to Google and Microsoft and Huawei and DeepSeek?
After Sputnik was launched, you saw in a 10-year period, federal investment in science and technology triple, from $5 billion each year to roughly $15 billion. And you're right. DARPA, was then called ARPA, was created. NASA was created. The National Institutes of Health was bolstered immensely. The National Science Foundation, saw its budget increase astronomically. An act was passed that allocated almost $1 billion towards universities to pursue basic scientific research and development. So yes, you saw basically the government became a huge provider of scientific research, and the best and brightest scientific minds were drawn towards working for the government because there was a lot of capacity and that's where the money was.
And that's now changed.
Now you're right. The best and brightest go work in private industry because the salaries are much better. That's where the innovation is happening. That's where the cutting edge development is happening. It's not happening in the government. And this is a huge difference between that post-war era and today.
And just to, in China, where you have DeepSeek, Huawei, these other things that are competing with technology, those are the same brilliant Chinese minds, but they're working for higher salaries for the government. I mean, give us an idea of that.
I think I'm not an expert in the Chinese innovation ecosystem, but the relationship between the state and the private sector is a lot tighter in China. So my understanding is that they are companies, they are private companies like DeepSeek. However, the link to the national government and the party is a lot stronger.
And you mentioned earlier about the diplomatic missions in Silicon Valley and this sort of thing. When you have, I think you've got the Google, the Microsoft, you've got your CEO is a part of the Indian diaspora. Somebody comes from Singapore, somebody else is from Argentina, and whatever. Where does national loyalty lie when it comes to this sort of Cold War hostility that's growing at the moment?
I think it's case by case. It depends on who the CEO is and what their specific background and affiliations are. this is not to question. Look, if you look in the media, especially right now, a lot of CEOs are professing their commitment to national goals and national missions. A lot of them have aligned themselves with the state, especially under the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that there's no process, there's no mechanisms of accountability or connection between a single businessman, which is really what we're talking about. These are just private individuals whose overarching interests are not to the nation, like a general would be, or a foreign policymaker or an ambassador, but they are towards their companies and towards their bottom line. And so while sometimes those interests might align with the national interest, they might not. And that is the situation I think we should be concerned about.
Yeah, I think that is fascinating. Can I just give you a question from Philip Bowman, who's in the audience? Can developments in artificial intelligence be slowed or even stopped? Yes or no?
So this is a raging debate in the artificial intelligence community about whether to slow artificial development or to accelerate it. I think what we've seen so far, after ChatGPT was released in 2022, I think there is now so much commercial interest. There is so much money that has poured into developing artificial intelligence that the idea that we are somehow going to collectively agree to slow down or pause artificial intelligence development is unrealistic. I think if anything, it's going to accelerate even further as upside becomes more apparent.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll leave that there, but we will be coming back to you on that fascinating element of the debate. But now we're going to deepen our discussion with Dr. Stephanie Kam, professor at the China program at the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Her most recent paper is AI-Powered Anti-Corruption Drive, the Chinese Party's State Fight Against Graft. And she specializes in that intersection that we've just been discussing about between politics and technology. And she's going to talk to us about it from the perspective of a rising power like China, but also the implications for small states like Singapore and superpowers like America. Stephanie Kam, give us your thoughts.
Thanks very much, Humphrey. All right. My slides are up. And thanks very much, Lord Bruce and the Democracy Forum for the kind invitation. So I'll cover 3 points very briefly following from Gordon's presentation. I'll first cover the nature of the tech race with reference to Beijing's vision of techno-industrial order. And then secondly, I'll move into how supply chains have become weaponized in the process of US-China tech war. I'll also briefly provide an overview of how Beijing plans to map its emerging techno-industrial order, contrasting it with the liberal order of the US. So some of these points that were touched on earlier and during the discussion, hopefully will also raise some further questions. And then finally, just as a rejoinder, to show why Southeast Asia is actually leveraging on the tech race between US and China, using it as an opportunity to build and to grow markets. So my first slide, when we think of this, the three points that I was given, semiconductors, AI, and space, I had to think about what these 3 terms mean, because obviously I'm a China politics person, so I don't do these semiconductors, AI, and space. But from an IR perspective, I think we can think of these broadly semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and space from the perspective of international relations, in that they can be viewed under this broad category of strategic frontier technologies. They can also, as Humphrey mentioned, they can tilt the balance of global power. The same tools can be used for commercial purposes, but can also be weaponized. And finally, there's increasing interest by the state to intervene, as we've seen in the China case and increasingly under the Trump administration. So my first point on the new tech race is that, a decade ago, we'd see phones that were designed in California, the chips were made in Taiwan, and then assembled in China and being sold everywhere. But today, this is increasingly a big problem with the increasing entanglement of supply chain. So both the US and China obviously see that as a national security issue. And this conforms with the logic of neoclassical realist theory, where AI is essentially a force multiplier, a capability that can shift military, economic, and normative hierarchies. So obviously, China and its peer competitor, US as well as China, its peer competitor, will want to leverage it given the perceived payoff of AI dominance. When it comes to middle powers like France, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, as well as smaller powers, what do they do? IR theory tells us that they adopt hedging or bandwagoning AI policies to preserve their autonomy. So as we know, and as Humphrey and Lord Bruce laid out earlier, we've seen under the Trump administration, CHIPS and Science Act, $53 billion to bring chip factories home in the US. We've also seen a slew of export rules to block China from buying some of the best AI chips. But when it comes to China's own perspective, we see that there is a very clear blueprint by the state. So the Made in China 2025 policy essentially is a whole of a nation plan that pushes the public as well as private sectors to invest in homegrown chips, as well as artificial intelligence in the effort towards what they call self-reliance. And this plan is helped by new laws that help to steer private firms towards state goals. So if you look at the range of export control restrictions and economic laws that have been introduced, Beijing's vision of techno-industrial order is explicitly security-linked, state-steered, and it plans to dominate advanced manufacturing. The recent white paper, China's National Security in the New Era, just released less than a month ago, reaffirms this concept of national security. And AI is also linked to the overall concept of national security, along with a number of other components like politics, military, economy, culture, society, and so on. But when it comes to the US model and the Chinese model, differences can be seen in a number of areas. These include ownership, R&D, research and development, and also market focus, and also the way they integrate security. Just now, Humphrey mentioned this relationship between the state and the private sector is much tighter in the Chinese context. I would agree with it, except for the fact that under the Trump administration, we have also seen Donald Trump move quickly to repeal Biden's executive order and to issue his own order, the removing barriers to American leadership in artificial intelligence. And that, I think, is a clear signal that the US is retreating from AI regulation in favor of more in favor of greater state-led AI governance. When it comes to tech giants, in the US model, it seems to be much more shareholder-driven with boards and CEO accountability, but Chinese counterparts, as you pointed out, most of them are state-owned with party presence empowered. within these commercial firms. The R&D model is also very different. American innovation, as mentioned briefly just now, is also very much venture capitalist. But when it comes to Chinese innovation, it's very much party-led. So a lot of military civil fusion labs and red supply chains that are nurtured by the provincial government. And of course, the emerging areas, innovation-led economic growth, wherein emerging and disruptive technologies give way to a array of industries, economic models, and social structures. And as China realized that retaliatory tariffs were not an effective tool for replacing American exports, Beijing saw that the key to import substitution was technological advancement and price advantages of its industrial supply chains. And this was, of course, complemented by Xi Jinping's emphasis on new quality productive forces, or the 新制生产力. You can see this in how local governments from Shenzhen to Wuhan top up national money with grants for humanoid robots or robot startups. So what we're seeing is a really closely linked public-private metrics in which domestic venture capital, municipal land deals, policy bank loans function in a way towards the purposes of import substitution at a large scale. When it comes to market focus, US firms historically chase global revenue first, but Chinese firms prefer to perfect their offerings in a protected market before venturing out with state-provided insurance. And then last but not least, the point earlier, security is, as we've seen in the most recent white paper on national security, security is very much tied to artificial intelligence and the development of technology. So when it comes to the weaponization of AI tools and economic export restrictions and economic laws, they've become weaponized, increasingly weaponized, and here refer to this paper whereby the term weaponized interdependence, I think, is particularly useful, refers to the context whereby countries leverage global networks of information and financial exchange for their own strategic advantage. I think this is exactly what is happening with the chips, the export controls, China's hitting back by banning of export of critical minerals that are used for anything from semiconductors to fiber optic cables, solar cells, bullets, and weaponry, and so on and so forth. It's also, as you can see here, expanded its own institutional repertoire of economic laws to deal against tech sanctions and export restrictions by the US. Cables and clouds, I'm not going to go into much detail on this, but when Australia blocked Huawei from laying an undersea cable to the Solomon Islands, China rerouted by building alternative routes. And of course, countries, the intermediary countries like Vietnam and India can pass data localization laws that can also slow these cloud firms. So in my foreign policy piece that I published in March, I argue that as supply chains become more diverse and complex, these range of options to evade such sanctions grows, and the role of third-party intermediaries becomes more critical. So perhaps this is where I bring in Southeast Asia, because the strategic rivalry between US and China in this arena has brought about unexpected implications for regional development in countries in Southeast Asia, particularly in Singapore, where I'm currently located. So there are a number of advantages, unexpected advantages for ASEAN being a prime location for this map is for those of us in the audience who may not be familiar with Southeast Asia. There are a number of reasons for ASEAN or Southeast Asia as a whole, being a prime strategic location for this tech war. First of all, is of course factories. After US imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, there were many companies like Foxconn. They shifted their iPad and assembly lines to northern Vietnam. And there are also, second of all, lots of spillover benefits for countries like Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, Thailand. They're also looking to expand the semiconductor industry. There are a number of initiatives that have been introduced in the recent times by these countries. So many of the top US chip makers, including Intel, Global Foundries, Infineon, as well as Chinese firms like JCET, Tongfu, Microelectronics, and Huatian Technology, of course, along with other Japanese and German firms, they're also interested in investing or expanding the operations in the region. Despite hurdles, there are hurdles in developing our own indigenous chip industries. For instance, Singapore has limited scale due to its small size. Malaysia has a talent gap. Vietnam has underdeveloped infrastructures. China's capital, technology, and expertise offer a very significant spillover, or perceived as offering a very significant spillover benefits for the region. And last but not least, there's a gap to be filled. There's a demand side apart from the supply side. There's a rising middle class in many developing countries in Southeast Asia. East Asia is also the fastest growing market for electric cars. So EVs, smartphones, and cloud services are increasingly popular. So a company that designs in Shenzhen, assembles in Bangkok, and then sells in Jakarta, helps to also spread its risk and also reach new customers. So investments in fintech, EV, obviously they're rising, to meet the demand for such services and goods in Southeast Asia. And when we think about ASEAN as a whole, ASEAN is already China's biggest trading partner. So from the perspective of economic influence, China is clearly winning. We look at the IC's Institute of Southeast Asia State of Southeast Asia survey in 2024 and 2025, and the United States is also fourth. So all this means. I think what this means for the United States is that export controls might slow China, but they also push factories and the money, capital to places like Malaysia and Vietnam. And that also changes who holds the real leverage on the ground. For China, laws such as the newly introduced private economic promotion law, which tries to keep private capital more aligned with the state's own tech goals, also at the same time, we're also seeing a parallel innovation by local governments, provincial governments, to cut their own deals with ASEAN neighbors. So there's a very interesting parallel between the central and the local. And finally, for Southeast Asia, I think the region can really hedge by selling, minerals, data hosting rights to both sides, and also use this choose what it wants in return. So I will end off with that, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that follows. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for that. I love this phrase, techno-industrial order. Is that what it's not a new world order, we're going into a techno-industrial order, is that correct?
Yeah, so I might have taken it from somewhere, but I think this is a very apt description to describe. Yeah,
and it prompted me to think of the title of our debate: Semiconductors, Artificial Intelligence, and Space. Are these the new frontiers of dominance? Have we got this right in our categorization, or is there another frontier that we haven't thought about, or is one not a frontier?
Yeah, I think it depends. It depends on how you define the frontier. Are we looking at? I mean, we talked about the DeepSeek, where we're dealing with open source information, but we're also dealing with the use of AI for industrial applications. So I think there's two sides of it. On the one hand,
it's dominance, which could mean two things. One is the economic dominance, but the other one is strategic dominance or Cold War mindset dominance, which I think is significant there. But you also made a very good point about Southeast Asia hedging and being able to sell and work with both sides. Give us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I mean, one way I think we can look at it is, I mean, the example that I gave was with some of these how local governments are actually working within from Beijing, working with Southeast Asian countries. I think one way to look at it would be the example of Shenzhen. I think Shenzhen is a good example of how. I mean, you can think of how local governments might try to work with, maybe Shenzhen and also Guangxi. Guangxi is also another good example of how local governments initiate to work with Southeast Asia. So that's one example. I think. The other example,
of course, is the headquarters of Huawei, isn't it? Which has swept the West until it got chopped down. It came in ahead of all the tech companies here in Britain for doing our telecoms and everything. And then these Cold War red flags went up about it.
Yeah, so there are collaborations between Huawei, as you mentioned, with Singapore, and of course in Malaysia, there are also collaborations. I don't have the data on the specific nature of the collaborations, but I think this is a good example of how, while a lot of there's a push from the top down for a national level top down push, but the local governments are also very much incentivized, obviously for profit, for all these benefits, to actually build on this momentum and to collaborate with countries that are open to leveraging on this new investment by the state within Beijing. Southeast Asia is located very close to China, as you know. So there is a lot of opportunity for say the Huawei CEO to make a 6-hour flight to Singapore or to Malaysia for that matter. Unlike flying to the US to the Microsoft headquarters in Silicon Valley, which takes over a day. So I think that also adds to the kind of incentives.
Can I give you a very quick question from one of our audience? Anand Singh Tomar says, in terms of ethics, how far can artificial intelligence be trusted? But of course, morality, ethics, values are different in China than they are in the US. So how does that question even begin to be answered? Give us a...
Should I answer it, or should I let Susan take this?
I'd like you to give me your thoughts on it.
Yeah, that's a very big question, and I'm not a moral ethics philosophy expert, but definitely, I mean, as I mentioned, the China model and the US model, there are vast differences from the R&D model, and I think the way the state controls the private sector, I mean, that in itself is different. But when it comes to morality, ethics, I really don't have a very good answer to that. I think you really need the faculty of human wisdom, human foresight, probably, and that is independent of any state or government.
I think you have great wisdom, Stephanie, for not answering it, because otherwise you'll get yourself into a lot of trouble. Thank you. I think so far we're getting a very good idea, but I think what is that in the US you have this comparatively new model of shareholder interest, private. That all the brains are with the private sector, and they are chasing the commercial model. Whereas in China, if that's the right thing, you still have that link to the state. And doing things for the national interest. Please pick me up if somebody think that very quick upsum is completely wrong before we go to our third panelist, Professor Susan Ariel Aaronson, Research Professor of International Affairs at George Washington University, Director of the university's Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub, and she's a familiar and expert face and voice on media outlets. And among her many writings and many things, data is disruptive, data is different, so policymakers should pay close attention to its governance. The question within our debate is on these new frontiers of dominance. Can there be global governance, or is it bound to become a fight? Susan Aaronson, give us your argument and your prediction.
Good morning, and thank you so much for this opportunity. First, I want to say that I think it's very important that we talk about AI in its many dimensions. And so AI is a general purpose technology. So it is something that is essential to economic growth. And so many countries, not everyone, but even Yemen has an AI lab. Policymakers in many countries now believe that they must nurture AI. And that's one of the things that I write on, AI nationalism. So first, it's an economic technology. It's also what we call a dual use technology. It is now viewed as essential to national security. And I cite the use of drones, unfortunately, to both protect civilians and attack civilians in the Israel-Palestine war, and as well as in the Russia-Ukraine war. Finally, AI is a public good, and that seems so lost from this discussion. And so if you view AI as those three things, one must think about how you govern it internationally and share in its potential benefits and risks. And the problem is there's a huge misunderstanding of what AI is. I've been working on AI since 2016, and I basically believe I know nothing, but I am funded by NSF and NIST as part of the NSF-NIST Trustworthy AI Institute. My job as a co-PI in that project, which is an institute that NSF established for 5 years, is to look at how can we make AI more trustworthy and trusted? And those are two very different things. Unfortunately, if you view AI as a global public good, the governance cannot be just by China or the United States or the EU. Unfortunately, the way that this is being governed at the national level. And while the British government, as example, has had started the tradition of AI safety summits. The G7 has all sorts of efforts to try to govern AI internationally. There is an actual treaty at the Council of Europe that more than 140 governments have signed. But this treaty and these actions, none of these things are binding. And part of the problem is, as you know, AI is changing so rapidly that it is very difficult to govern. And when nations do try to govern it, and I'll just take as example the EU AI Act, they find over time that firms and constituents want to change that model of governance because it isn't working. It isn't achieving that balance of regulation that you must achieve to stimulate innovation, but also to protect people from harm from AI. I want to talk now about the relationship to democracy, because I think that's really important. I have noticed in myself that the more that I use AI, the more de-skilled I feel, and that means I probably am losing skills. And I just cite as example, Google Maps. I used to know how to read a map and could steer my way. But now I feel like I've become reliant on a tool, which is de-skilling. And this is happening more and more to people. And I'd be curious to know if you all agree with me, but de-skilling in terms of spell check as example. And more people use ChatGPT and other chatbots to help them write more clearly. Nothing wrong with using a tool. But if the tool is de-skilling, that's going to have huge implications, direct and indirect, for democracy. Because if you can't read and write effectively, you cannot be an effective citizen in a democracy. And that's something I hope we all think about before we conclude that AI is our future. One other thing on that line is that AI has become an obsession in the United States, even though I see the Trump administration as undermining AI through its cuts to research, through its threats to open speech, and its threats to universities. And we are rapidly losing our AI expertise to other countries because research cannot occur in an environment where people don't feel safe to express their opinions. And if you want evidence of that, there was a Pulitzer Prize winning book called The Heavens and the Earth, and it talked about the space race between the United States and Russia in the 1950s and 60s. And the conclusion of the book was basically, and this has had a huge impact on the study of technology. The conclusion of the book was that the United States had to become more bureaucratic to succeed, whereas Russia had to allow physicists to speak and astrophysicists to speak more freely. It had become more like the United States. And I see the United States becoming more like China in terms of AI, and China stimulating innovation. And by the way, it is private companies in China that are doing this innovation. DeepSeek is an example of it. Certainly the government funds a lot of AI research, and certainly the government has made data a key factor of production and has come up with rules to govern data that may give China an advantage in terms of trust and access to data. And we can talk about that a bit more. But I'll end there so that we can open up the floor to more questions.
Thank you very much, Susan. There, just your last comment there takes me back to a point right at the beginning. Private companies are doing the artificial intelligence in China.
Yes. And
yes.
DeepSeek would be a perfect example of it, but not DeepSeek alone.
Yes, exactly. So I mean, the point I think that's sort of coming out of this is you have the sort of American model where everybody thinks and speaks freely and invents great things. You have the China model where theoretically nobody can speak their mind and they don't make such great things. But where are we? Where is that balance?
I disagree. I think in China there is, certainly China is an authoritarian state that has the great firewall and restricts and censors. But in terms of innovating ideas, I work with Chinese professors, and I'd be keen to hear Stephanie's and Gordon's thoughts on this. But that doesn't mean you can't think of new ideas and think of ideas in different ways. The whole DeepSeek model was built on a hedge fund that used AI to invest, and they figured out ways. I mean, you and I don't know for sure that they created a more energy efficient, data efficient, cost efficient model, but they claimed that. And that's why it set up such a furor, because they were able to train on large parameters of data. So they used a very large training data set, openly scraped from the web, but they did so, they said, in a more, and no one has been able to verify this. That's where I would say the censorship and opacity comes in. But I don't think the Chinese model, yes, it is different in terms of how innovation occurs. And yes, the state plays a role, but the innovation is occurring. The difference, I think, is diffusion of technology, which is key to technology success. And one thing, in my own research, I would say, let's get out of this. Like, this is a dialectic between China and the United States. Let's talk about the UK, which I think, even though it has a very small population relative to both of those countries, the UK is actually doing this right, because it is trying to build trust with its citizens on AI. And it does it by constantly surveying its citizens, asking, what are you concerned about? What is the risk that you see in AI? And it is building governance on public concerns.
Of course, the UK created DeepMind,
Yes.
which was the piece of software, artificial intelligence, which changed the whole Chinese thinking towards defense. So DeepMind, created in the UK, beat the Chinese human at the game of Go. And then the Chinese defense establishment and Xi Jinping said, hold on, we've got to shift our budgets a bit to move into what I think we're discussing now. But that is a tangent. But when you mentioned UK, I'd like to bring Gordon back in to see, I wanted to drill back a little bit down into this different cultures or different ways of doing things, and which one is going to, which one is better, Gordon, because we were talking about it earlier. The Chinese communist model or the American capitalist model for the new frontiers?
I would echo Susan's point that the frontier has closed between the United States and China in advanced AI models. I don't think, I mean, there are benefits to the Chinese system, there are benefits to the American one, but I think in terms of developing cutting edge AI and developing these frontier large language models, I think there's very little daylight between the two countries. The advantage that China has, and this is because of a strategic choice that they've made, is they are emphasizing diffusion and adoption to a much greater degree than the United States is. So the private AI labs that are in the lead in the United States, like OpenAI and Anthropic, even Meta to some degree, though they have made their llama models open weight, which is not the same thing as open source, but they've made them open weight. But there has been an emphasis in the US AI labs on secrecy and being more closed in the development of their cutting edge models. China is going for more of a strategy of, and you see this in DeepSeek, they want others to be using their models to a far greater degree. So it's the question is whether you believe it's a smarter strategy to be the model that everyone uses and to proliferate, or whether you think it's a smarter strategy to be closed. And I think it's predicated on this idea that these labs have, that they're going to develop super intelligence on their own, and then they're going to be the ones that control it, and it's going to have this immense upside.
Stephanie, can I bring you in here? Is there no daylight? Is there no cigarette paper between these two systems when it comes to outcomes and results?
Yeah, I'm of the view that this the dichotomy between authoritarian and democratic regimes when it comes to the discussions of AI and tech might not be the best model to understand it. I think when you think about the diffusion and adoption, I'm not an expert on these, and probably Susan and Gordon would be able to better unpack these terms. But from what I understand, there are different stages or different types of AI, from basic AI research, building foundational models, that sort of thing, to AI plus, which China calls AI core, AI plus, and then AI 4. And AI plus is the arena where the building of smart city, digital plans, serving cross-border e-commerce. And then AI4 would be more, I think, more aligned with the kind of a public responsibility, approach, where it's more mission-driven towards like climate change, precision medicine, maritime navigation, and so on and so forth. So I think these, perhaps it might be better to look at these stages if we're thinking about where are they competing, where is China leading, or where perhaps the US might be much better and might still be having an edge over China, and so on and so forth, and work from there, rather than looking at these two, which political regime types, which I think is good for discussion, but might be a bit distracting, I think.
I think it's very interesting. So we have two different systems of governance, but they are neck and neck. But then in the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the US was neck and neck in a lot of its technology until the US.
Well, that is very consistent with US history. I mean, you may recall the competitiveness movement in the 1980s. Gordon, you're too young for this, but I remember in Washington watching union leaders bang on Toshiba radios and Toyota cars. The thing is, this very much makes me uncomfortable, because we're ignoring the fact that Microsoft and Falcon, which is the UAE's AI, all of these private companies or government-funded companies are also competing with each other to succeed in variants of AI. And there are so many different models, and how they diffuse, how they are understood to be helpful, is going to be very different related to the purposes. So last year, to me, this is kind of funny, but the US government, before the Biden administration left, became sort of obsessed with calling all this, and this comes from Stanford, foundation models. And a foundation model is a model that can be widely used and applied for many purposes. So whether you want to use it to teach geometry or to fly a drone, you could use a foundation model. And so all I'm saying here is that I don't think there's so much diversity. Painting this as a dialectic is not useful. And also we lose, and I think this is so important, the fact that this is a technology that really could help solve public goods problems. I cited an example. How do you prevent the spread of pandemics? How do you deal with immigration when you need certain types of immigrants, but you don't need other? To solve wicked problems, AI could be really useful, because it can crunch huge troves of data.
Can I put in a question? Sorry, a question that we can go to the panel generally from Martin Hobby, based on what you were saying, Susan. Are these technologies likely to become an area of collaboration rather than competition between nations? So is there going to be a dividing line between how do you solve a pandemic and for artificial intelligence, and how do you blow up your enemy? Gordon?
Well, my concern and my view is the same as Susan's, that if we embrace the arms race narrative, and if the forces of capitalism, of commercial interest, are what is driving the development and the production predominantly, like I think that can be an element, but if those are the primary drivers, geopolitical competition and capitalist imperative to return profits, then we're not going to get these public interest benefits. We're not going to get AI for big scientific discoveries in fusion energy, for instance, or for disease monitoring, or any of these public good cases. So I think those are I mean, as Susan has noted, which I think is right, is there's a ton of diversity in AI applications, in AI models, in the players. This is why I brought up the private players, to talk about how they're, we tend to just look at the nations, but even among nations, there are all these different nations producing it. But I think these two overarching forces, these two forces are driving it, and we're going to miss out on the public benefit and the real societal breakthroughs that could happen from this technology.
Can we move on to another couple of questions from the audience? We've spent a lot of time on AI. This is semiconductors and space and a bit of AI. These are our three new frontiers of dominance. Ritesh Nigam says, extracting resources from space like lunar or asteroid mining could give richer nations a further edge in the global economy. How might developing nations counter this? And there's another question that kind of links in from Frank Zhu. How can artificial intelligence help us to adapt to the realities of modern conflict, and what might be the dangers? We sort of touched on that, but let's move it on. Stephanie, how do developing nations counter this, if it happens, this sort of lunar and asteroid mining, or is this a purely speculative question?
Yeah, I'd like to respond to the previous question, actually, that was about the possibility that countries can work together.
Yes.
So maybe I will respond to that first, and then give me some time to think about that question on minerals, which I don't really have much knowledge on. But I think just to add to the discussion, I think we also might want to think about areas where regulations might overlap. So, for example, China has its own global AI governance initiative, and it rhetorically, obviously, it champions, being responsible power, denounces technological monopolies, and so on and so forth. And then you might want to compare that to Europe's AI Act to kind of see where they're actually areas of common interest that they might be able to work together. So that might be one way. In terms of the minerals sector, I really don't know much, but from what I hear about the minerals sectors in countries like Indonesia, developing countries within Southeast Asia, that these countries also suffer from governance issues, right? Weak governance issues. So when China comes to bring in capital and works with the host countries, they tend to try to yield or work in ways that actually end up exacerbating existing problems on the ground. So I think that is a problem, and there have been pushback in the past in Indonesia by the local population. Yeah.
Sorry, Susan, I'd like to flip to you in just a second on this. Can there be a governance on this? But I want to just quickly with you, Stephanie, that the whole thing about semiconductors appears to hinge on this relationship between Taiwan and China, because they've got 90% of the market or something like that. Can you just explain that to our audience? Because these are the two sort of Cold War foes or new Cold War foes, yet they control this whole industry we're talking about.
Yeah, that's quite a hot topic as well here in Southeast Asia. When it comes to, based on our interactions with the Chinese in the think tanks and from speaking with those in Beijing, is that, China obviously cannot afford to lose Taiwan. And it's a matter of international legitimacy. So the question of face is really important, as we know with most Chinese, Chinese foreign policy, the conduct. It's also about domestic legitimacy, so like signaling to the local population that the party is still in control of Taiwan, and at the same time, with the hardening of the rhetoric from Taiwan, I think there's also a kind of a concomitant hardening and assertiveness on the part of the current Xi Jinping.
So whilst the politics is getting more acrimonious, the truth on the ground is that they're going to have to keep working together in order to keep our semiconductors coming. Susan, I wanted to come to you. Global governance, is it going to be possible before time runs out to get some sort of structures going on these issues that we're talking about, so that there can be some form of global governance?
Well, clearly, I mean, my concern is that many of the industrialized countries are sort of captured by the big tech firms. Not that the firms all have the same interests, but they do see a future for AI in military. That's where the money's going to be. And excuse me, I should have said defense. And I think this is very worrisome. There are ways that governments could work together both to ensure the public good nature of it and ensure that more countries can participate. So, for example, one thing that could be done, I think, is the UN could stimulate and call for the funding of a shared research organization that developing countries could benefit from, a CERN-like institution. CERN is located in Switzerland, and you pick a neutral country, and there's all things that you might have to do. Another idea is to create like an agency. I've called one a wicked problems agency, where they could rent data from societal entities around the world and use that data to create LLMs that solve problems that transcend generations and borders. Keen to hear what others have to say.
That's interesting. Could you mention the military element there? Gordon, perhaps on this one, I believe, I might be wrong, that when DeepMind was sold to Google, there were clauses in the contract that said it couldn't be used for defense work. But that, I think, was back in 2015, and technology moves on. Are those types of contracts still valid, or is everything dual use and the private sector's pushing it forward, as Susan says?
There was a big reaction in Google because the company was participating in something called Project Maven, which was to provide artificial intelligence capabilities for the Defense Department. There's a recent book from Alex Karp, who is the CEO of Palantir. Palantir has made its business. They're a software company that provides big data analytics primarily for defense and intelligence agencies. And Palantir has been, and Alex Karp in his book is leading, kind of the charge for saying, companies should be, working more with the military and bidding on military contracts to a greater degree. I think there's still resistance in companies for moral reasons and otherwise to participating in artificial intelligence applications for defense purposes. But I think it's a bigger picture, and to tie this into the governance discussion is that I think the area that is most pressing for a global governance solution is in military applications. And I actually think that's much more attainable than something more general to apply to AI overall, because as we've been saying, AI is a lot of things, and to get some kind of grand global bargain on AI is not going to happen. However, there are very specific military applications of AI and different rules that you'd want to have in place that it is in every country's interest to adhere to. Like, I don't think any country wants a situation where humans are kept out of the loop in AI decision-making or in nuclear command and control or other situations like that. So I think you could actually get some kind of agreement on that. I know there are groups that have come together to try and articulate what those norms and rules would be so far.
Susan, I know you have to go in a couple of minutes. Give us your last thoughts. Semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and space, are these the new frontiers of dominance?
No, I don't think so. I don't know. And I think we all should admit that we don't know. I think data created sectors are the new frontiers of dominance because, and I'd cite, we have not talked about virtual reality at all. And to me, and the British government would be a perfect example of this, the British government leads in viewing data-driven technology as a form of infrastructure and using digital twins to deal with complex problems like flooding. I've monitored this since I think 2011. So I do think, so what are digital twins? They are an online model using data that you can use to like figure out how would a drug affect a person who has this kind of cancer and this type of blood type. And I that could become huge, and it already is huge. Like everybody uses various forms of XR. For example, when they want to pick a paint color, they can take a picture of their living room and then play with it online. So it's already in wide use, but its implications could be great, and who knows what it's going to be. Sorry for that long-winded.
That's fine. I'm going to add virtual reality to to the thing. Thank you very much, Susan. I know you have to rush off.
Thank you.
Stephanie, we're going to Barry Gardner shortly to sum up, but can you give us a final few seconds thoughts, top line thoughts? Semiconductors, artificial intelligence and space. We're adding virtual reality to that from Susan. Are these the new frontiers of dominance?
No, I don't think so. I would disagree, and maybe this is a minority view. I think the verdict is still out in terms of whether AI or some other form might emerge as the tool, the ultimate tool for the frontier of this dominance.
Okay. And when we talk about new frontiers of dominance, and you talked about that wonderful phrase, the tech industrial order, is it more of the same developing generally, or are we living in a completely different world now?
Yeah, I think it's definitely different. I mean, the U.S. in the 19th century, there were telegraphs, railroads, and then moved forward to surpass Britain. And then you have American firms again in the late 20th century, riding on the wave of silicon chips, and then to kind of leave post-war Japan in the background. But then now we have this fourth industrial revolution, which incidentally the U.S. and China are peer competitors in. So I think it's still it's changed a lot, and that's I think a sign that we have advanced a lot since the days of railroads and telegraphs.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. Gordon, I'm going to say it again, semiconductors, artificial intelligence and space, the new frontiers of dominance. We're putting into that virtual reality, the fourth industrial revolution and the techno-industrial order. Give us your final thoughts.
There might be a number of other technologies that you'd include in this also. I mean, quantum computing as it develops, biotechnologies, which is something we haven't talked about.
Yeah.
I think the larger point, the point is not that these technologies specifically, there's something inherent in these technologies that make them prone to or focal points for competition based on the technologies themselves. It's that we're living in a more competitive world now. It's a multipolar world. We've ended the period, we had the Cold War period, then we had this period of unipolarity where the US was kind of the only game in town. And now it's a much more competitive world geopolitically. China has risen to be a peer with the United States in many domains. And it's not just China and the US. There are all these other rising powers. We haven't talked about India. Stephanie was talking about the role of Southeast Asia, which many countries there are becoming more prominent, Brazil. So I think it's the fact that we have this narrative in the first place is just a reflection of the fact that we're living in a much more competitive world than we were before.
And could I just ask you a very quick one, because we haven't really talked about space that much. Is it a malign or a benign environment, as Lord Charles Bruce said at the beginning?
Well, it's increasingly becoming more malign. There were reports a couple of years ago of Russia purportedly developing a space-based nuclear weapon of some kind. The competition over satellite internet service, there are new competitors to SpaceX that are rising around the world. And you mentioned that in your resource extraction. There's definitely interest in that among countries. So I do think we will continue to see more competition in space rather than just viewing space as an area for discovery and scientific understanding.
Gordon, thank you very much. Please stay, because we now are going to our Democracy Forum chair, Barry Gardner, who is probably in the House of Commons or nearby as a member of an MP for the ruling party in Britain. He's been following the discussion. Have we nailed it, Barry? Over to you.
Oh, wow, Humphrey. I'm nowhere near the House of Commons, actually. The Commons is in recess, and I am blissfully on holiday in the Mediterranean, hence the lack of a suit and tie. Look, you talk about dominance. You talk about dominance between humans, but surely the dominance that we need to be thinking about is the dominance between AI and humans. This is existential for us, as many commentators have already set out. And Gordon, you talked about a more competitive world. And of course, in recent history, that's certainly true. But if we go back to when these issues first came about, the new technologies that enable different warfare, and also the privatization of those technologies. I was thinking of the privateers of the 17th and 18th century who dominated the seas. Rival powers had to license them in very much the same way as governments are having to license this new technology. Then we had Spain, we had Portugal, we had France, we had Britain, we had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all vying for dominance. So I don't think this sense of competition is terribly new. I was interested when Charles talked about the Golden Dome and reminisced a little about the time when Ronald Reagan had Star Wars. Of course, in those days, I think I'm right in saying that Ronald Reagan said that once they developed it fully, then the sensible thing would be to give it to the Russians as well, so that they could both be assured that they were protected. And, strangely, I wrote in big letters across the page here, the letters FEAR, fear. Fear is dominating this debate about our new technologies. And Gordon, you spoke of a Cold War style veneer to this technology, and absolutely there is. I thought it was fascinating when you talked about the 40 countries having missions in Silicon Valley. We are treating these private companies as foreign nations. And interestingly, all that you said about the way in which government funding is being cut now. You said NASA, I think, by 25%. Was it the National Science Council by 50%? And we see the huge investment going in on the private sector. And I remember there was a book that came out, must be 50 years ago now, by an incredibly charming, modern philosopher called Bob Nozick. He was at Harvard, and he put the rival theory to John Rawls, who was the more social contractarian, and Nozick was the invisible hand that developed the state, but it had to be a minimalist state, and he developed that theory very elegantly, and it seems to me that what we're looking at now is almost the inverse of that, where actually the state diminishes and the separate powers that are the private companies could actually begin to dominate here. And that linked with what Susan and you were saying about if we embrace the arms narrative, if we see profit as the motive that's going to continue to drive all of this, then the public good goes out the window. And, Susan started what she said saying AI is a public good. and then went on. And therefore, it needs global regulation and governance, not just at a national level. Now, thrilled as I was to hear her say that my country, the United Kingdom, is doing well in this. Let me tell her it's not how it looks from the inside. We are deeply, deeply troubled about the way of getting governance right here. And I do think that unless we can get some global agreement, then this is a technology that can run away with us. It's almost as if we could see ourselves moving beyond the nation state with this, because these are such powerful technologies that they have the ability, quite literally, to see a superior life intelligence to our own. Let me go backwards, though, to talk about some of the things that Stephanie touched on about national security, because these are critical areas where we see the power of AI coming in. Surveillance and cybersecurity, these are critical areas. Predictive policing. I was at a meeting with the Metropolitan Police just last week or the week before, where they were showing us the new AI recognition tools that they would be using in public spaces and how they were going to be used. And critically here was the algorithms that were going to control them, and how they could be adjusted for bias. And so that is, bias and accountability is so critical in this. We're looking at that predictive power that can be an amazing tool for good, as Susan was saying just at the end there. But it's also capable of going off in what many of us would see, I think, as the wrong direction. So I thought to myself, as you were all speaking, I thought of, where is there another international space, not outer space, but that is out with the control of national governments? And interestingly, it's the high seas. And, it took centuries to get any form of agreement on the high seas. UNCLOS was the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And actually this June, we're sitting down in Nice to talk at the UN Conference on the Oceans, to talk about a high seas treaty, to talk about the oceans, the Global Oceans Treaty, and BBNJ, as it's called, biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, how we control those areas that are beyond national jurisdiction. And it seemed to me that if you go back to Grotius, I know this is sort of leading us off in a very anti-progressive historical direction, but if you go back to Grotius, what you find is that he set out some of the clear principles that we had to think of. He talked about res privatae, private things, res publicae, public things, res nullius, nobody's thing, and res communis, everybody's thing, the thing we hold in common. And what's happening here is that if the public good does go out the window, if it is something that simply the promotion of profit and the embracing of the arms race are the driving factors behind this, and it becomes privatized, then we end up with what was actually in 1804, the 8th Earl of Lauderdale talked about, And he said that as private riches increased, as we enclosed land and what had been communal, the res communis, enclosed that and privatized it, then public wealth declined. And I think very much here what we've got is a situation where we see this clear conflict between the governance, the governments, the national states struggling to control these technologies, driven very often by fear. But if in fact the private sector makes the investment, grows these technologies to become more powerful than the national state, then we really are in a situation where we are beginning to move way beyond nation states and nation governance. And then it's not a matter of, is this a new frontier of dominance between those states? It actually becomes very different indeed.
Barry Gardner, thank you very much for that fascinating perspective and context there, talking about the law of the sea and the upcoming Conference of the Oceans. Yes, there's always regulation to put in place. We are out of time. Thank you to the audience for your questions and comments. Thank you, our panelists, Gordon LaForge, Stephanie Cam, and Susan Ariel Aaronson. Now, on the evening of June the 30th, we have a very special in-person Democracy Forum debate streamed like now, but it's also at the National Liberal Club in London, where our panel of experts will debate an Asian NATO pipe dream or future security network. I'm even tempted to ask our panelists what they think there, but I will resist that temptation. And our next debate is at the same time on Wednesday, June the 11th, against the backdrop of a US-China trade war, how European Union free trade agreement could be a game changer. As I said at the beginning, the Democracy Forum examines really important issues that are often not seen on the mainstream media. Hope to see you then. And until then, from all of us at the Democracy Forum, stay safe and goodbye.
The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.